Hello and welcome to today's Rancher Online Meetup. We are going to be talking about CICD today, and it looks like we're going to have a great audience and hopefully an awesome turnout. My name is Shannon Williams. I'm one of the founders here at Rancher, and it is great to have so many of you joining us today for our monthly online meetup. I am today joined not by Darren, my co-founder. He's not on the call today, but rather by two of my coworkers, Chris Urwin, our Director of Field Engineering, who is based in the UK. Chris, how are you doing?
Yeah, good. Looking forward to it.
All right. And Bill Maxwell, who is the Director of DevOps here at Rancher and has been with us like Chris for more than 2 years, I think. Bill, how are you?
Well, thanks.
Awesome. So today's meetup is in a lot of ways pretty similar to our meetup we hosted last month, where we dove into container networking in a lot of depth. We're going to be really spending today talking about kind of all aspects of running CI/CD with containers, Kubernetes, Docker, and we'll get into the agenda in a minute. But just as a quick reminder, we run these meetups every month, and I say this every month, but this really is meant to be a meetup. It's not a webinar, and what that means is we don't really set a time for these events to wrap up. They never go just an hour, so please be prepared for a longer discussion. We do record the sessions and post them, so if you have to leave early, don't worry about it. But the big difference too is that this is meant to be a dialogue and an open discussion. So in addition to presenting and talking, we also really welcome questions from everyone who's attending. So we have a questions pane that you can see on the GoToWebinar screen that you're more than welcome to ask questions on. We will try to answer them as they come in. Sometimes we can't get to them, or sometimes they're about a topic we're going to be talking about in a minute, or sometimes they're a question that I just don't know the answer to. And so it sometimes takes us a little while to get back to you, but we try to answer them all before the day wraps. And at the end, when we have time left, we just go through and finish off all the questions, take more questions. So if you've got sort of big, broad, general questions about containers or Kubernetes or Rancher, Docker, whatever it is, feel free to hold on to those. The other big thing is these are not sort of canned presentations. We demo a lot. Sometimes the demos break. Sometimes the networks go down. Sometimes we're using cloud services that somehow end up offline. So if something's not working, we try to have another version of it available. If that's also not working, we'll just explain what we were trying to cover and move from there. So things sometimes break. Please be patient. The other thing is we've got because we run these consistently. If you're ever looking for one that we've run in the past, please go to our YouTube channel. We put them up there every month. You can find it at youtube.com/c/rancher, and you can see, typically these things do go for 2+ hours. This is last month's discussion about networking. We talked about building an enterprise CAS, a number of things about the Rancher 2.0 rollout when it was launched earlier this year. So you can kind of go back there and just roll back and see all sorts of topics. This is actually the second time where we've talked about CI/CD in depth. I think we covered it 2 years ago. What's certainly exciting to me is, I think when we did it the first time, we maybe had 500 or 600 people register. Today we have almost 4,000 people registered for today's meetup. So it's awesome to have so many people here and interested in the topic. If you are joining us for the first time, or would like to get to know everyone, we do have a Twitter handle that we use, #Rancher Meetup. And please introduce yourself, post a picture, show us where you're doing, what if you're eating your lunch while you're watching. It's awesome to get to know who you are. Are you new to Rancher? Are you already using Kubernetes? Are you trying to figure this stuff out? What do you use for CI? Share it there, get to know other people, make some connections and friends. But yeah, just #Rancher Meetup whenever you want to post something out there about what you're working on. All right, so today's agenda, we're going to cover really 2 main sections of the presentation. Chris is going to go first, and he's going to really kind of discuss the approaches we're seeing to to implementing CI/CD with containers and Kubernetes. He's going to talk about some of the different tools that are out there, the basic principles of implementing CI/CD with containers, and then he's going to dive into a pretty in-depth demo of how to build a full-on pipeline using GitLab and Kubernetes and Rancher 2.0. We'll go through a lot of examples about how to hook up repos, how to do builds, how to do deployments, and you should be a pretty in-depth discussion. I think he's going to be using either the hosted or the on-premise versions of GitLab. I think he was playing with both of them this last week, so you should learn a lot about those tools. And then in the second session, Bill's actually going to preview the upcoming pipeline and deployment features in Rancher 2.0. He'll kind of talk about what that is, how it compares to other CI tools, when we think people should use it versus some of the more powerful complete solutions like GitLab or Circle or some of the other things out there. And so we'll kind of help you understand what that looks like. And then similarly, Bill will dive into a demo of that and sort of what the integrated pipeline functionality looks like and what the roadmap for it is, what some of the things we're working on there. At the end, we'll wrap up with whatever questions and answers are remaining, and we'll get into all that. Before we dive, just for anyone who's new to us, if you're not familiar with Rancher, we're a software company. We're an open source software company. We build a number of different open source projects, the most popular of which is Rancher, which is an open source container management platform. It's free to anyone to use. It's very easy to deploy and manage lots of Kubernetes clusters, whether they're hosted or on-premise, running in, for individual teams or groups of teams. We tend to really solve a lot of the problems associated with how to bring this stuff into production, from connecting it securely to your RBAC systems to dealing with monitoring and logging and how to connect different teams and control their access to different parts of the cluster. We also, as a company, sell support and services and helping organizations implement this. So we have more than 250 customers around the world who rely on us to help them, bring Rancher into production. What's really cool about it is not only an open source project, but it's also a very technology agnostic platform, meaning that the idea of Rancher is to centralize all of the management of containers and Kubernetes wherever it runs, meaning, Rancher can deploy and build clusters for you, or it can onboard existing clusters from hosted services like Azure, Google, Amazon. You can import existing clusters that you've spun up with some other tools. And Rancher would then sort of handle all of the operational management of those clusters, from provisioning and adding infrastructure to dealing with auth and RBAC and security on them, but also deals with all of the workload management, which is obviously going to be our topic today, and how teams can take Kubernetes but then really get the most out of it by connecting it to their CI processes, by using application catalogs, by consuming Prometheus or Datadog or other monitoring services, and connecting up logging services, and we make all this stuff very easy. So what Rancher is really a platform for organizations that are adopting containers and Kubernetes as part of their core IT strategy. And so we as a company, we basically pay the bills by providing a supported implementation of all of this for our customers, but that's a pretty small part of the global usage. More than 10,000 organizations run Rancher every day, so it's mostly an open source project that lots of teams use. All right, so with that, hopefully for any of you who are brand new to Rancher, you kind of know a little bit about what it does. I will dive into the real topic today, which is all about CICD and how to kind of build out your containerized integration and delivery platform. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris. Chris, you all set? You should now have the presenter's controls.
Fantastic. I just need to pick the right screen. Right, can you just see the building a CI/CD pipeline slide?
I can. You're good to go.
Excellent. Okay. So what I want to talk about is I'm going to go through sort of on the basics what CI/CD is, sort of the benefits that it can bring, and sort of places where you should be using this. I'm going to have a quick look at what products are currently available on the market. And the main bit that I really want to focus on is how to integrate with 2.0. So we go to a lot of clients who sort of use Rancher, and they want to integrate with their existing CI/CD pipeline. Now, because Rancher 2.0 is all built on top of Kubernetes, and we do things slightly different with the auth in that we act as an authentication proxy, people are sort of finding challenges when they're trying to connect through to the sort of Kubernetes cluster that's been provisioned via Rancher. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to enlighten everyone on how to sort of set that up and get it running and allow you to integrate with the existing CI/CD pipelines that you've got. So for people who like to play along at home, we've actually just published a blog literally a few minutes ago that's going to run through the stuff that I'm going to go through here with GitLab. So you'll be able to set up a GitLab server running on the GitLab.com hosted service, and basically it walks you through all of the things that you'll need to do within your Rancher and your GitLab setup to actually get it deployed. So you can use that as a reference as I'm going through. There's no commands that I'm going to be running different on here. The only difference that I'm going to hit with this is that I'm actually going to be running locally in my lab, because sometimes there's a challenge with GitLab running it in the hosted one, in that the provisioning can take a little bit longer than it can on local infrastructure. So rather than have you sit and watch a sort of a spinner go around for about 45 minutes, I'd rather just sort of let you see the full thing working through as sort of swiftly as possible. So please do ask any questions, and I'll try and answer them as we go along. But what I want to do, I'm just going to go through a couple of these slides. And talk about what CI/CD is. Okay, so what is continuous integration? Basically, it's a coding philosophy and practices. What it's trying to do is it's trying to sort of encourage best practices amongst devs to sort of do small changes, check coding often, and have it really sort of continuously build your application and check for errors, and check sort of when you've got a large organization with multiple people checking coding at the same time, basically just checking for that consistency and checking that it builds and packages and tests consistently throughout the sort of the life cycle of the build cycle of the application. So it's aiming to encourage better collaboration and sort of higher software quality. Sort of gone are the days where you used to do monolithic changes, where you used to roll something out once a year and you sort of follow your waterfall model and sort of do your coding and all the designs done up front. Sort of DevOps and Agile have brought in this sort of culture where everything's sort of constantly changing. So your objectives for this week that you're expecting to accomplish in the next week may change. It depends on what sort of coding and what sort of practices you're following for actually developing your code. So what continuous integration is trying to do is basically it's an enabler for allowing you to do very quick deployments and sort of very small changes, but allowing you to sort of roll them through and have them constantly checked and tested. So the continuous delivery part is around sometimes called continuous deployment, sometimes it's continuous delivery. So continuous deployment it's around the automation of getting the application out to your infrastructure. So continuous delivery is the same, but basically to production. So I say continuous delivery in this context in that the application that I'm going to show here is effectively going to my production because I'm not doing anything other than a single service. But what you'll have in most enterprises is you'll have your development environment, you'll have your staging environment, and you'll have your production environment. So what a lot of places are doing is they're doing continuous deployment into sort of the development environments or their staging environments, but there's usually gates and things that you have to go through before you can deploy something into production. You have to schedule outages or whatever. And what this is sort of trying to do is it gives you the option. So most places I would say are probably doing continuous deployment, but continuous delivery is where you really want to get to if you can. It depends on the sort of the vertical that you're working in as to whether or not you can actually achieve that. So it automates all aspects of delivery of your actual application into an environment. So as part of the continuous delivery cycle, it will upgrade sort of not only your web services, but also database schemas or any sort of middleware that needs to be attached to that. And it allows you to sort of deliver everything as a whole through the whole pipeline from start to finish and get your application up and working. So as it says here, mature CD delivers regular code updates to live service. So this is where applicable, if you can get to that, it's like the nirvana. But in most instances, there's usually things that will sort of challenge that. Now, one of the things that sort of challenges this is around application architecture. So there are certain things that will stop you doing continuous delivery. So things things like database schema updates, if you're not coding in a way that sort of supports the upgrades of the databases and the services, and they have to be closely coupled, then it can cause challenges when you're actually trying to do this deployment if it's not all part of the same thing. So considerations are determining when features are enabled. So there's a few different ways that you can enable sort of continuous delivery, and sort of you can use feature toggling where you turn on toggles in either the database or in config files as part of the application, and that will sort of say whether or not it tries to call a particular path of code. So what you would typically do is you would upgrade your database but have the feature toggled off on your application, and then when your database upgrade's complete, you can toggle it back on. The great thing about this is typically it means you can toggle it back off again if there's a problem. If you closely couple the actual application architecture to the database schema, so the two are closely sort of tied, then you can hit problems when you need to roll back, because effectively it usually means you have to restore a database, which will mean downtime on your application, and will get your bosses reaching for the P45s. Okay, so containers make this really easy. Because of the way that containers sort of, they start up, they stop, they can run for a long time, they can run for a short time, and they don't really store any state for the vast majority of containers. It makes it really easy to upgrade these components and have them run. So you can do CICD in sort of typical infrastructure where you use something like Puppet or Chef, and you sort of have that go off and do changes and deploy the application for you. But it's just not as easy as it is with containers. And certainly the rollback is a lot simpler when you're using containers to do this sort of stuff. Okay. Most of these names will probably be quite familiar. So there's a few on there that are sort of new and coming things. So Cyclone, I know, is one that both Bill and Shannon, when I sort of had them on the slide, said, oh, I've not heard of those. So it's an open source project. I've not used it, but it's been developed specifically for containers. And the other ones are sort of the familiar ones on there, the Jenkins and GitLab. I'd say are probably the main ones that we come across when we go into enterprise organizations. So what I wanted to do was I just wanted to have a quick talk about the sort of the features and the freeness and whether they can be run on-prem or not. So I just sort of knocked this together. So some of it is probably debatable, like Bill's pointed out to me that Jenkins, you sort of can have a hosted option on CloudBees, but then is that necessarily Jenkins sort of hosted? But what I wanted to get across was there's lots of free options out there. So some of these are free with restrictions. So in some of these instances, you can only run 1 or 2 jobs, or you can only sort of deploy 1 or 2 containers. Some of them are tied to you being specific to open source, but most of them have sort of a reasonable restriction on what you can do. So the GitLab one, which is talked about in the blog post that I've done, it has a great amount of sort of availability as to what you can do. That sort of the features aren't as restricted as some of the others are. But one of the main restrictions with the hosted GitLab and the free option with that is that it can't be deployed to multiple endpoints. So you can typically, well, you can only deploy to a single endpoint in terms of Kubernetes environment. So you can't have a pipeline that builds to your dev, to your staging, and your production environment in a single one with the free version. So you'd have to pay for sort of functionality like that. But it's enough for most places to get up and going. And like I say, what I wanted to really do was to show how we can be integrated into basically anything that can talk to Kubernetes and do a deployment direct into Kubernetes. Bill, have you got anything you want to add on these ones? I know you've used a few more of these than I have.
Sorry, I was maybe mute and I was looking up, trying to answer a question in the chat. Sorry. No, I mean this is a pretty comprehensive list. Well, a pretty good list of you know, CI and delivery tools. I think there's, just to note, there's some other more delivery focused tools that are kind of rising and certainly popular. You know, the Spinnaker, which was a Netflix project that, you know, they were using to sort of be able to deploy across clouds. And then there's another one out of Pivotal, I believe, is the one working on it. But the like Concourse and sort of their delivery pipelines, and they're really both of those are more specialized for delivering apps and clusters, more on the as you move from just kind of your normal build process to more of the whole delivery focus.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've sort of experienced with the companies that we talk to as well is the requirement for on-prem. There's quite a lot of places that we talk to that have sort of air-gapped environments where they can't have sort of internet connectivity for doing this sort of stuff. So I think that's true of the experience you've had as well, Bill.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One of the questions that came in on the questions thing, Chris, was from Philippe, and he asked, where would you position infrastructure as code in this sort of CI/CD model that you're talking about? And anything you'd add to that?
So there's a couple of things. I mean, this is primarily talking about how we talk to Kubernetes and sort of talk to Rancher. I mean, some of these products will actually allow you to spin up a Kubernetes cluster in GKE or wherever to actually do the testing and deployment themselves. So I think the infrastructure as code piece, when you sort of linking this into Rancher, probably sits before this step. So you'd use the infrastructure as code to spin up the Rancher server, to spin up your clusters. And then this piece would actually take advantage of those clusters that have already been provisioned to actually spin your services up and run them in it. I mean, there's nothing stopping you if you wanted to within GitLab and most of the others in that you could have a step in there that actually called the Rancher CLI to spin you up another Rancher cluster to deploy to. But it would be a little bit more convoluted than straightforward. But yeah, I would say the infrastructure as code piece probably sits before this.
Yeah, I mean, to build on that, like the topic right now that we're really sort of discussing and focusing is more of the engines that sort of power it. The process is really, I mean, there's the basics, but I mean, it's usually some sort of build step, some sort of test plan, validate and then deploy, and then if that works, test, validate, and move. That generic process sort of is universal, but like if you've got a repository of Terraform code, you could use one of these tools to basically run the test plans, validate that, or actually execute the plan if it is what you're expecting, and then run validation tests against that. I mean, really you're keeping the infrastructure bits as code, and this is really just sort of how do you move that change in the infrastructure code to production safely, right? That's really what the gist of this is validating those changes are safe.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So yeah, so as we sort of said, the main thing we want to discuss here is how to get sort of your CI/CD pipeline to integrate into Kubernetes and this sort of into Rancher Kubernetes specifically. So as I mentioned before, the way that Rancher does its authentication at the moment is everything gets proxied through the Rancher server itself. So some of the tools that are built to talk to Kubernetes can't necessarily handle that sort of indirect communication to Kubernetes, even though we're just running Kubernetes. So what I'm going to show you is a way to basically expose your sort of created cluster, your child cluster, where you want your application to run, and allow you to talk direct to that, sort of bypassing the Rancher server. So this will allow whatever your CI/CD tool is to talk directly to the Kubernetes API server within your child cluster and provision your applications and talk to your ingress and everything else. So this is just a sort of a typical CI/CD flow where you sort of start at the bottom in this instance and you've got the plan code, you build and test. So this is what some of your sort of tools are going to do. And then the CD piece, which is the release and deploy, where this is going to push it out into your sort of your Rancher cluster so you can access it and test it and everything else. So I'm going to go on to the demo. Now, I'm hoping that the demo will work. I was going to do this on GitLab.com, like I said earlier on, but I tried it earlier on today and the shared runners were absolutely killing me, and the registry was taking far too long to push to. And then about half an hour ago, I tried to show Bill what I was going to do, and it failed on my home lab as well. So I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that this is going to work for us. And like I said, the blog post that I've got up today will take you through all of the steps that I'm actually going to go through today, so you can do this at home. Another resource that I wanted to point out is we've actually done some work on our QuickStart guide. So our QuickStart guide before was just basically showing you how to do a manual QuickStart and sort of spinning up a Rancher server and doing everything manually. So what we've actually done now is we've sort of added a couple more quick starts where we've given you some Terraform to quickly stand up a DigitalOcean one. We've given you a Vagrant quick start. So we've got a repo that sort of gives you sort of the Vagrant files and can have you up and running with a Rancher cluster very quickly. And we've also just checked in the AWS code this morning. So there's an AWS Terraform quick start as well. So when the documentation gets updated, we'll get that pushed into here as well. And there's a couple of other little things that we've done on deploying workloads. So you can deploy a workload with an ingress or with a node port. So I'm going to go to my running cluster. So this is my Rancher cluster. I've got 3 nodes that's running on my vSphere box at home. They're not massively powerful, just sort of 4 gig boxes with a couple of cores apiece. And this was just deployed a couple of hours ago. So those of you familiar with the sort of Rancher interface, I can go in here, I can look in my kubectl, and we can see that they've been up for 31 minutes. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to go to, I've got my own hosted GitLab server as well internally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to just use one of the templates that GitLab provides you out of the box. I'll just use the Ruby on Rails one. I'm going to say this is for the Rancher Meetup. And you just create the project, and it's quite straightforward to sort of go through this. The difficulty in setting up the registry, if you're doing the hosted on-prem, sort of the on-prem hosted yourself implementation of GitLab, is setting up the registry, because it requires you to have HTTPS. So you've got to have a certificate. And depending on how you provision your hosts, if you have a self-signed certificate, you need to ensure that your hosts are going to trust that. So I've sort of had to mess around with that a little bit, but we've got it working in the end. So this has created me a repo. It's got a load of files in there, but I'm not actually going to make any changes to the application itself. I'm just going to deploy it as it is. So there's a couple of steps that I need to run through. So the first one is setting up Kubernetes and linking that setting up Kubernetes within GitLab and linking it through to the Rancher Kubernetes cluster that I've got set up there. And the second part of this is actually enabling the auto build part of the sort of the GitLab product. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the Kubernetes setup. So I think we'd like to make this a little bit simpler, but at the moment there's just a couple of scripts that you need to run to get the information out of sort of the Rancher server to allow you to connect through to this. So you can give it a name. It's going to be anything else, so I'm just going to call it my cluster. So to get my API URL, all of this stuff's detailed in the blog, but I'm going to SSH onto my server that's running my Rancher server. So if I do a docker ps, I can see that my Rancher server is running there. It's the only thing that's actually running on there. And there's a script that I downloaded, which again is documented on the blog site. And what it's going to do is it's going to allow me to basically generate a kubeconfig file for the cluster that I want to talk to. So if I just run this against my server, I'm just going to set it going. I'm just going to show you what it's doing. So my cluster in here is called NVMe, and I just ran my script and passed in the name of the cluster that I wanted to get sort of the credentials for. And what that's done is it's created me sort of the script. It's created me the kubeconfig, so it gives me the certificate data that I need, the endpoint server which I need to talk to. So this is actually the endpoint server, sorry, the kube API server for the cluster that I'm running here. So I'm going to put that into my API URL. And the other bit, this certificate bit, is that certificate that it showed at the top. So I'm just going to cut and paste this and decode it. So I need that in PEM format. So I just use this little base decode. I give instructions on how to do this from the command line as well. I just find it easy to do it here. and then I paste that into here. And then the other thing that I need to do in order for me to be able to talk to the Rancher Kubernetes cluster is I need to create a service account and token to talk to direct to the server. I don't want it to be sort of talking with an admin account. So I've created a gist that I've sort of documented on here. So if I go to here, it will show you my gist. So all it's doing is it's going to create you a GitLab managed apps namespace. It's going to create me an account, a service account within that namespace, and it's going to grant me some sort of access to that, and it's going to create me a secret, which is going to be the token that I'm going to use to connect through to this box. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this URL just to show you that I'm working from the same thing. I'm going to take this command, and I'm going to run it within my Rancher cluster. So I'll launch my kubectl. I'm going to paste that in there, and that should then go away and create me my namespaces and everything else. So now if I do kubectl get namespace, I can see there that it's created me my GitLab managed apps namespace. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the next command here, which gets me my token, and run that again in my shell. And I'm going to copy and paste it. So this is effectively your password to connect through to your Kubernetes cluster. So as I've said, those steps are pretty much what you'll need to do to connect any sort of CICD pipeline that can talk natively to Kubernetes to get it to connect. So typically you've got to give it the Kubernetes API endpoint, you've got to give it the certificate so that it trusts the endpoint when it's talking to it, and you've got to give it a user account and a token. So you can take that gist that I've done and sort of mangle it around, give it your service account a different name, give it a different namespace, but basically those are the building blocks that you will need to actually connect your CI/CD pipeline through to your Rancher 2.0 cluster. So
Chris, there was a question that came in, and it was you know, why is it necessary to go through the config for a cluster to get this, as opposed to getting the Rancher proxied kubeconfig directly from the Rancher UI?
Because so some applications will allow you to do that, but GitLab certainly doesn't, and I know some of the others don't. And it's the way that they parse the URL that we use to connect through to the Kubernetes cluster. So if you look at when you're talking to one of our clusters, it's got a bunch of extra parameters in it. So if I go into here, it's got this extra parameter in here, which is our cluster identifier. And that gets embedded into the path of the sort of the Rancher server Kubernetes URL, and some of the sort of the kubectl some of the parsers within the CI/CD tools can't handle that extra parameter. So I know GitLab have got a change in there that they're going to get it embedded so that you will be able to use it in the future. You'll be able to talk direct to the Rancher server, but what this does is it's basically a workaround to allow you to talk direct to a cluster. So in instances where you've got a CI/CD product that won't allow you to talk to the Rancher cluster via the sort of the authentication proxy, this just allows you to talk direct to the cluster that you want to actually deploy the application into.
Yeah,
what I wanted to do
involved, and
it's used in a few places. Go, Bill. Sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say we're working on this, and we recognize it as a bit of a limitation. So, you know, part of what we're doing in future releases is that we'll be moving some of the authentication that we generate, the tokens that we generate will be cache local down at the cluster level. So you can use the Rancher generated tokens at that cluster level. So you can talk directly to the cluster with our config files. And then that'll also help in situations where Rancher is unavailable, because then you can still directly interact with the cluster at that point, as long as that token's been used within some period of time.
Yeah.
So we're working on improving that.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got all my credentials here for my cluster, so I'm just going to add my Kubernetes cluster. So once that's saved, there's a couple of things that we need to do. So we need to install Tiller, because the way that GitLab deploys the application from the GitLab server down into the actual Kubernetes environment is it uses Helm. So I'm just going to install Tiller into that. And the other thing, because I'm running on-prem, I'm going to have to install myself a GitLab Runner, which is the thing that does all the sort of processing and sort of building and everything else. So it uses the runner within the Kubernetes cluster to actually build the application and push it up to the registry that's running here. If you're using the GitLab.com one, you don't actually need to do the GitLab Runner. There are shared runners that are available, so you get a certain amount of free minutes on the shared runners. So you don't actually need to do that in the cloud. You just need to have the Helm Tiller installed. Now, the ingress, you don't need to install, because by default, when Rancher deploys a Kubernetes cluster, we automatically install an ingress on all nodes. So when this actually does the deployment, our ingress picks it up and publishes it anyway, so you don't need to do the install of the ingress. So that's basically all you need to do to set up the Kubernetes side of things. So I've got my application, I've got my Kubernetes cluster, and I've got my link from GitLab through to Kubernetes.
So there was a question, Chris, that came from Nathan a few minutes ago, and he asked, is it possible to deploy GitLab itself on Rancher? I tried adding the GitLab Helm chart as a catalog app, but wasn't able to launch it through the Rancher v2.06 UI. Any comment on that?
I've not actually tried it, so I'm running it as a container, but not actually running it under Kubernetes, because I regularly blow away my clusters, so I didn't want to blow away my demo as well. In theory, it should work. There's no reason why it shouldn't. There's a couple of things that you'll need to be careful of. Most of the applications, including this demo one that I'm going to deploy, will require you to have a default storage provider. Now, out of the box, if you've just done a normal deployment of Rancher onto sort of bare metal or onto an EC2 instance, and it hasn't got a cloud provider set, it will need to have something deployed to it. So what I've done in this instance is I've actually deployed our NFS driver, which basically just stands up an NFS server within the cluster itself, and then it makes it the default storage class. So there's a lot of the apps within the Helm catalog that require this default storage class. If you don't have that, most of them will fail. So I check around that.
Yeah, or if you're just testing and messing around with things, you can, usually they have like persistence enabled, and you can set it a Boolean for that to be false.
You can.
And then you don't need persistent storage. But yeah, like typically a default Helm chart assumes a lot of configuration, and so they don't typically work, and I just want to play with this configuration without a lot of options. So it's just, but there was another question, Chris. Someone was asking, is Helm required for application deployment through GitLab?
Yeah, I believe it is for this one. So I think that's the way it actually does it. It basically updates a Helm chart on the fly within your cluster to allow it to sort of do the deployment. Because what it's doing is, as part of the build process, it's going to push the build image up to this registry that's part of the hosted GitLab sort of server itself, and it does that via the Helm chart within the actual Kubernetes cluster, within the namespace actually. But that's not necessarily true of all CI/CD products. I just think that's the way that this one works. So depending on other products, it may be doing things differently. Just for the GitLab one, I've not been able to get it to work. I think if you don't deploy it, I think it actually deploys it as part of the production task that it generates as part of the pipeline role. So it will get there anyway. Okay, so I've got my link through to my cluster. One of the things that you will note on the building the CI/CD pipeline blog is that I recommend, well, it's a prerequisite to get this running. You have to have some sort of persistent storage enabled in your cluster, because this default application actually deploys sort of a Postgres container and sort of a Ruby container. The Postgres container by default requires a backend storage provider, and your deployment will fail. So I think that's where I went wrong when I was showing Bill earlier on. So I'm hoping that this will work this time through. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to enable the AutoDevOps piece. So the AutoDevOps piece is basically where it's going to watch my repository for code check-ins and then it's going to build my application, and it's going to deploy my application. So I'm just going to use the default AutoDevOps sort of functionality in here. But what you can do is when you create your repos on the GitHub, you can create effectively the flow and the steps that you want as part of your pipeline in a YAML file. And what the AutoDevOps piece does is it looks to see if there's a YAML file or that definition already there. If there isn't, it just creates its own default one. So I'm going to enable it. It wants a domain name. So typically you will have your sort of wildcard ingress and any apps being forwarded through to your ingress. So you'll have a DNS record that it will point to. Because I've just stood this up at home and I don't have that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the IP address of my host and I'm going to use nip.io. So nip.io is great. It's like zip. It will basically just resolve to 192.168.0.242, but this has to be a domain. You can't just put in an IP address. And by default, this will give you continuous deployment to production. So I'm going to leave that checked because I want this to just go through, do the build, and actually do the push through. But you can have automatic deployment to staging and then a manual deployment to production. So this is what I was talking about with the continuous deployment and continuous delivery piece. So when I save that, what it's going to do is it's going to generate me a pipeline. So I can now go and have a look at my pipeline. And as you can see, it's already started running this. So the default steps that it's going to sort of create, it's always going to look like this. So anyone who runs through that blog will see all of these things automatically done. It's nice because it shows you what sort of a typical CI flow should look like. So it's got in there, it's got a code quality check. It's got a container scan in there, so it uses Claire to do vulnerability scanning within the container. That piece is actually broken at the moment. It was working a couple of weeks ago, but it now doesn't work on the GitLab.com or on my hosted one. So there is a bug open with GitLab about doing that, something to do with timings, I think. And it's got a couple of other tests that it does out of the box in there. But at each stage of this, you can go in and have a look at what it's doing. So if I scroll right up to the top, so this was using my my runner. So this runner is the one that it's deployed into my Kubernetes environment, and this is where it's actually running all of these commands. So it's pulling down the Gilder Labs image, and it's going to do me a build. When this build's finished, it takes a few minutes, a couple of minutes, it's going to push it up to the registry, and then we'll go on and follow the next steps through. Is there any other questions, Shannon, just while I'm waiting for this for a minute?
Yeah, there's quite a few. One of the questions was, was one from Sean, and he said, "Is this demo geared towards people who are using Helm to deploy applications into Kubernetes clusters, or just directly?"
No, absolutely not. So this is just this demo is really geared around making CICD talk directly to Kubernetes. Now, each CICD provider is going to have some way of deploying that actual application into the actual cluster that you're running in. So Helm is the standard way of doing this with Kubernetes, but they may have other ways. They may just run kubectl commands. It's going to depend on the CICD product. So this one uses Helm, others may not.
Got it. And there was another question that just came in from Prismac. He said, where exactly is this app being tested and built before it actually gets deployed? Where are you actually running all your tests and build work?
All of this is actually running in that GitLab Runner. So that GitLab Runner, sort of you can see it here, it says it's waiting for it. So if I go into my cluster and do get pods, GitLab managed apps. Let's try it with kubectl. And there you can see it's got this runner. So that's the runner that it's actually executing on. So it's actually running this within my Kubernetes environment, within sort of a bunch of pods. So it's actually doing the build within my Kubernetes environment, and then eventually it's going to deploy it to my Kubernetes environment. So as I said, with the hosted one, what happens is you can run that job on shared runners. So they've basically got a bunch of machines that are running Docker, and it will do the build on those machines and test it on those machines before it pushes it to your actual endpoint Kubernetes. But because I'm running this all on-prem and I've set up that GitLab Runner, it's actually running the build within my Kubernetes cluster. So as you can see here, it's pushed it up to my sort of cluster here. So GitLab.rancher.space is the DNS name for my local GitLab server. 4567 is the default port for the registry to listen to on GitLab. Root is who I'm logged in as. Rancher Meetup is the name of my repo, and it's built the master branch. So that it's basically built me a container of that and pushed that up. So if I go back into my pipeline now, it will be showing that it's doing some other steps. So I'm actually going to fail the container scanning because I know it fails, and the code quality check takes a while as well. So rather than just wait for that to finish. So within the default flow here, test has to pass, otherwise it won't deploy it to production. So we'll just have to wait for this test to finish running. So again, it's running this within my cluster on sort of the pods that it span up there. So it's detected a Ruby app, and it's just going to run some tests against it. Once that's completed, it should automatically then deploy out into my cluster. Any more questions, Shannon?
Yeah, there are a couple more. So there's one from Amulia. He said, can you please explain a little bit deeper about GitLab Executor? Is it running on Docker or Kubernetes?
So the actual runner itself is running as a pod within Kubernetes. So that piece where I went into my Kubernetes and in here, this GitLab Runner is basically running as a pod within Kubernetes on my sort of cluster itself. Like I said, when you go in to, I think it's in here, you can go into the runners. So what you can do is you can have shared runners. So if I really wanted to, I could push this up to the shared runners at GitLab, but because it's so slow at the minute, I didn't want to do that. So I'm running it locally. So it's just running it here within my Kubernetes cluster. Now, what it's running in within sort of the GitLab.com world, it could just be Docker. It could again be running under Kubernetes. I don't know. And to be honest, I don't care. It's just building me Docker containers. But actually running it within my cluster locally, it's actually running in Kubernetes.
Got it.
Okay.
There's another question Stephen asked, and he said, is adding a swarm to GitLab procedure written down anywhere? Do you know anything about that?
I haven't tried it, but because we're all Kubernetes, not Swarm, I haven't tried that.
Okay. There was another comment. Someone said that it looks like the script used to get Kubernetes creds for GitLab fails with parse error, invalid numeric literal at line 1, column 4. So I don't know if that helps you at all, but FYI.
And that doesn't. So I'm assuming he means this script that, where is it? This one, this gist. So this is the one that gets you the credentials. It shouldn't fail unless, no, I don't know why that would fail.
On line 1, are you running it in a bash terminal?
Yeah, yeah, it needs to be a bash terminal. It won't work on a PowerShell. Wow. Okay, so this has gone green. It's given me a success. So what this has done is this has actually deployed me my application, and it's given me an endpoint that my application should be accessible on now. So if I hit that, hopefully I'm on Rails. There we go. So that's the application deployed. So the last thing that I wanted to show was, so this is doing CICD. So if I go in and I actually change the application, so I'm going to go in and change the view, change the welcome, and I'm going to edit this file. So I'm going to say, okay, I'm not on Rails anymore, I'm on Rancher. So if I commit that change, what happens is that change is picked up straight away, and it automatically creates me a new pipeline, and it will go through the whole process again, and it will replace the container that's running there with the new version of the container. Now this build will fail because I've not updated the test as well, so it will fail at the testing stage. But if I updated the test as well, it would go through and it would replace it, and the ingress would then point to a container that said, you're on Rancher. So the last thing I want to show is this one does a little performance test at the end, and it sort of does a little test against the service that was running and gives you sort of your response time. So it's just a really neat way that I just wanted to be able to show people sort of who could make it repeatable and do it themselves when they can get the bash script to run, and sort of allow you to sort of go away and have a play and then hopefully hook it into your existing CI/CD pipeline. It wasn't really about showing GitLab particularly. This was just about showing how to get your CI/CD pipeline to connect through into Rancher and make it work effectively.
Chris, there's a question from David. He said, so do you use a single Kubernetes config for all GitLab projects, or would you use different ones if you were talking to different, different clusters?
Yeah, no. So if I spin up another cluster, I can spin up another project and I can talk to another one as well. So each project basically can only talk to a single GitLab. So each project within GitLab can only talk to a single Kubernetes cluster unless you pay for the premium version.
What's the difference there?
You can deploy to multiple endpoints. So this bit where I've got Kubernetes, what I can do is I can add an additional one. So I could have dev, staging, and production as 3 different clusters that I could deploy to. But because I'm using the free version, I can only have a single cluster that I can deploy to. But each project can talk to a different one. So if I create a new project in here, if I create a new project, in fact, I've got one there. If I go back to projects. So I've got another project here, which was one I was testing earlier on. And this one actually talks to a different Kubernetes environment. So it's got a different key and identifier and everything else. So you can have as many projects as you like. It's just each project is tied to a single instance of Kubernetes. So the other quick thing that I'll show is by default, the namespace that was created isn't added into the default namespace, so I can't see my application here. So within Rancher, you can go into the namespaces and I can take my GitLab managed app and I can move that into my default namespace, and I can then see the workload that it's just deployed. So my runner's there, it's unready at the moment. So there's something wrong with my Postgres, but my application's up and running. And yeah, it's having a problem with the writes. So there's an issue with Rancher OS and the NFS container that it's not happy with, but it gives you the sort of the basics of how to get this running and do a deployment from GitLab, whether it's hosted or on-prem, and talking through into your Rancher 2.0 cluster. So is there any more questions you want me to answer?
Yeah, there was a question that Nidic asked, and he said, is it a good method to deploy multiple projects in the same Kubernetes cluster? Isn't that more cost effective? Or, does it work? Would you always recommend splitting things up across different Kubernetes clusters? And obviously that,
no, you can. What I would recommend is that you have a different namespace for each one. Otherwise, you could end up with clashes. But no, you don't have to have a separate Kubernetes cluster. You could have multiple projects all publishing into a single Kubernetes cluster, doing the build. Yeah, not a problem at all. But like I say, I'd just recommend using a separate namespace for each one.
And so if you were using separate namespaces, how does GitLab, how would you use GitLab to talk to those different namespaces for different projects?
So when I set the Kubernetes parameters in here, expand, you just specify a different namespace.
Got it. So you could have different namespaces for each project then?
Absolutely, yeah.
Great. One question that came in as well was, how does Kubernetes handle the old pods and images used for building and deploying? Is it automatically cleaning them up, or does GitLab clean them up? Like, how do you not end up with a lot of junk in your cluster?
Yeah. GitLab will replace them. So when, if this had sort of succeeded, so I know this pipeline will fail because it will fail at the task. I'm in the wrong project now. It replaces them, but it doesn't delete them. So you would have to delete them using the kubectl command or via the Rancher UI. You actually have to clean them up yourself. Similarly, it won't delete the sort of the cached images on your servers as well. So you just need to be careful on your disk space. If you are doing constant deployments of sort of updates of an application, you may start running out of disk space pretty quickly if you aren't using something to go away and sort of clean up old images.
Got it. So is the output of this, this is a question that came in, the actual Ruby rail that was deployed, was this deployed on Rancher's Kubernetes implementation? And can you show where that's actually running inside of Rancher?
So that's what I was just showing before. So this is actually the Ruby application. This production is actually the Ruby application that was running. It's been pulled from my GitLab.rancher.space server, and it's been pulled, so it was using the master branch, and then it obviously gives it a unique identifier for the build that it's just done. But that is the actual container running within my Rancher 2.0 environment within the GitLab managed apps namespace.
Got it. And then, another question that came in about sort of the difference between namespaces and clusters came from Nick, and he said, if you have different namespaces per project, how would you handle the different environments like dev, QA, prod for each of your projects? Or would you recommend a cluster per environment? So like if I wanted to have 3, dev, QA, and prod, what do you think makes sense?
Yeah, so you could you could do it into a separate project. So what I would say is dev and staging, yeah, maybe you'd run those on the same cluster and put them in different projects on that same cluster. But what you would do with production is you should always run the production on a completely separate cluster. Never run any dev or staging or VMP or anything else on your actual production cluster. So you don't want anything to affect your production cluster.
Got it. And there was 2 questions I think they came in about where the Docker registry was actually defined. So did you set that up
so no,
when GitLab was installed, or is that just part of setting up your Rancher environment?
No, it's part of setting up the GitLab. So part of the sort of the GitLab setup is it gives you sort of a registry. So it stands up a registry. There's a few sort of YAML files that you have to edit and add certificates and stuff. But on the on-prem version, you basically turn it on and sort of it's running within the Docker container that my GitLab my GitLab server is running. So I've got one machine that's just running GitLab, and it's just running as a container, and it's running the registry within that. So it's running the registry process within that GitLab server itself. So if you run on the GitLab.com, they also have a hosted registry that it will automatically push to for you, and it becomes namespace. So if I GitLab, if I just go into my projects, so these are the ones that I was pushing for. So it has this registry in there, and I had sort of my Kubernetes set up and everything else. And if I go into my pipelines, what you'll see is, actually it's not in the, it's in the build. What you'll see in the build is you'll see that it pushes it up to their registry. So it's pushing it to the registry.gitlab.com, but then it's using my username and then my my project. So it effectively carves you out your own sort of unique piece of the registry on the hosted registry for GitLab. But there'll be, I mean, there's several ways you can do that. So some of the other products won't necessarily have their own hosted registry. They'll expect you to either push to Docker Hub, or you'll be able to push to a private registry. So in here, I can probably specify what registry I want to push to. It's just I've just wanted to do things default out of the box, just so that people could follow along and sort of replicate what I've done.
Makes sense. There was actually one question on that Daya asked. He said, could you please highlight the steps that may be different between a hosted and a managed GitLab in context of what you've been demoing? It seems like the blog is using managed GitLab, while this webinar is using hosted GitLab. Is there anything you just want to call out there quickly?
So the only thing that I had to do that is different, so all of the commands that I did once it was set up is identical. So none of these commands sort of, so running the Kubectl apply, getting the secret, actually getting the certificate and everything else is all identical whether you're using the on-prem or the hosted version. The only difference is if you use the on-prem one, you have to set up the registry prior to actually enabling AutoDevOps. Otherwise, it doesn't have anywhere to push it. So the documentation for that is sort of available on GitLab's manual pages and stuff. So you just follow those. Once you've got that registry up and running though, there's absolutely no difference between the two.
Great. A couple more questions. Is there anything you can explain about different deployment strategies that GitLab handles, and also kind of maybe compare that to, you mentioned Spinnaker and some of these other things, but anything you can kind of talk about there on sort of what the deployment approaches make sense. Another person asked, how do you approach CICD with Helm charts? You're kind of getting into the same thing when you're trying to move from sort of deploying the first time to upgrading and doing different approaches to kind of deployments.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of deployment strategies that you can use, and they're mainly Kubernetes ones. So you can deploy based on a sort of a rolling update, or you can do sort of a canary type deployment. It's typically more down to the way that you define the deployment within Kubernetes as to which one it will use. I haven't defined one here. I've just used the default one. You probably can define when you're doing your pipeline as to what sort of rolling strategy it uses for doing the actual updates, but I haven't sort of drilled into it. Like I say, this wasn't really about GitLab. It was more about connecting GitLab or connecting any CI/CD pipeline through to the sort of Rancher Kubernetes. I'm not an expert in GitLab. Literally, I've been using it for about a week and a half. So you probably can do that. I just haven't sort of investigated it to that depth.
Yep, makes sense. Okay, cool. Well, Chris, thanks for diving into this in so much detail and sort of walking through it. Bill, if you're all set, I'm gonna pass the ball over to you, make you the presenter, and maybe you can dive in now a little bit to the integrated Rancher pipelines feature and how that compares to something like what Chris was just showing us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so are we looking at a on-ramp?
I am.
Cool. So Rancher pipelines, there's currently a version in the existing product, and it's been a bit of a experience we sort of missed there, but we've got some work in progress that's really aiming to address a lot of that and make it much simpler to use. And sort of what we're really trying to do with the pipeline feature is, you've got a Kubernetes cluster, and that's great. And really, you want to be able to leverage that cluster quickly and start realizing the value of switching to kind of the containerized model and running on a container orchestration engine. And so out of the box, we want to provide just a basic CI/CD solution that'll cover most use cases, especially when you're getting started. And then, right now we're focusing on integrating with, GitHub and GitLab as far as like source code repositories, and really focus on, shipping and building the software without really having to worry too much about how it scales and how it, how to get the builds, integrated with the Kubernetes bit. So we're handling that part and really trying to enable you to really focus kind of on the code and the application stuff that's important to you. And so kind of the initial use case is really, just basically, a developer commits code, a change, the build, publish, and deploy happens on Kubernetes or with Rancher on top of Kubernetes, just leveraging a lot of the concepts that we've got there and quickly reach your users. Just for instance, one of the use cases that we're working on internally and sort of making sure that we can kind of hit is, the rancher.com website. We have a lot of changes in flight and having different folks that need to view and approve. They really want to see what it's going to look like. And so, we're working on having strategies where we'll be able to deploy the applications and have multiple versions running at any given time, and people can get links and check it out and say, yeah, that's good, and then merge it and have a path out to production. We've been using Rancher 1.6 with the webhooks feature for a long time, with a simpler strategy of just kind of having a staging site. And that works well, but just the amount of variance and sort of inputs that we've got coming in now and changes to the website, we're looking to scale a bit differently with kind of the 2.0 product. So, we're trying to be consumers of the thing as much as just building something that's really useful. And as we kind of take this out, it's not in this next release, but I think it'll be in the next release, if not by 2.1 for sure. And so what we're working on now is rounding out the security model and just making sure that we're not leaking anything and that there's a safe way to sort of have secrets in the environment and just isolating the build processes in the cluster so that you've got a decent amount of isolation, so that if you were to allow PRs to run, you're not just running arbitrary code in your cluster with other applications. We're going to work on integrating Rancher catalogs and Helm charts. There's a whole process. What we found kind of in 1.6 and we're seeing again is with the catalogs, there's a whole release process. Once you build, package your application in containers, then there's the catalog entries that sort of kind of go with that, with new versions, and the questions might change, and sort of how do we read the release process of that and integrate that directly into the pipeline feature that we're working on. Being able to deploy to different projects and clusters. What I'm going to show you today is a little bit limited in that it's unable to sort of deploy to multiple namespaces within a project, let alone different projects or clusters. But that is something we're looking at and figuring out how to integrate. And then it becomes pretty obvious, especially as service mesh is really projects like Istio are starting to make their way up, and other serverless type of solutions that are really starting to bubble up, and what that looks like. I think from a CI/CD perspective, there's a lot of opportunity there to really sort of integrate that, because ultimately those technologies really help enable kind of some of the safe delivery of these applications. So it's pretty exciting, and I think it's going to be one of the more interesting things. One of the things we've seen also is, as you grow with this, since we're focusing kind of being able to get up and running quickly, there are some products and projects that this is their sole focus in life. How do we, allow you to start here and give you a path forward to, start using some of these other projects for delivery, or how do we sort of, how do you use this to start and then move off entirely if you had to. There's just different reasons, but really we're focusing on just delivering a core set of value directly on top of Kubernetes right away, and then being able to, we don't want to lock you into anything. So it's been a long-standing design philosophy here.
Bill, there's a question on that kind of that says, as part of the roadmap, are you looking at validating vulnerabilities in the containers as part of the pipeline? It's a good question from Peter.
It depends on the tooling and how that could work, and and where that actually happens. Some of the registry solutions, as you push the image up to those solutions now, they'll automatically start scanning them for you. So it could be integrated that way. There's a lot of third-party vendors that have solutions, and so there might be, I think we have to sort of look at how those, what the interfaces are for those different solutions, and how we can best integrate with them. It's not, we're not opposed to it. I just don't know that it's in kind of like an initial phase 1 type of approach. Yeah.
One other question that came in on that is Stephen asked, what approaches are you exploring for integrating secrets into the Helm-based delivery pipelines?
Well, we haven't got to the Helm-based part of it yet, and sort of looking at what that flow is going to be. The secrets would either need to pre-exist, or they would have to be part of sort of the pipeline definition, and so that they would get injected and then substituted or created remotely. That's sort of what we're looking at with the security model, is what we're going to sort of do there. Currently everything sort of lives in a single namespace, and I think kind of what we're going to do is they'll be within the pipelines are scoped to a project now, and within that project they get their own namespace, at a top level. And so everything currently is operating within that single pipeline namespace within the project. I think as we want to get more finer grained, the way that we are handling RBAC and other patterns that we're following, with Rancher 2, is that each pipeline might get its own namespace, which would then have its own, which gives it its own context, and then you can have its own secrets that are, separated from other build pipeline contexts. So then, that would give a reasonable separation, as much as you would trust Kubernetes secrets in general, between the things. And so then from there we could, have that data, kind of come out and as part of the deployment process, and only run in that context. So only those pipelines and under certain circumstances would those secrets be available. I think like a PR shouldn't have access to production deployment secrets. So it's just sort of that's the model we're sort of hashing out. Before we want to call this product, before we think it'll be GA.
One of the questions that came in, I think Peter asked, is can secret management, like password changes, be added to the pipeline then, or is that not recommended?
I mean, it sort of is TBD. So I mean, you would have a secret, and that secret could be updated. And so if that secret was used as a deployment as part of your deployment step moving forward, then yes, it would update the secret in the remote side. And so depending on how your application consumes that secret, I think
Got it. So in a project context, then David said you would have multiple namespace pipelines, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, so you would have, a pipeline could, depending on certain exclusion, different paths, right? So master tagged could have a path that's different than some arbitrary feature branch, which could have a different path forward than an event pull request. So those different paths would each need different security contexts.
Okay. There was one last question that kind of was on roadmap was about Bitbucket. You mentioned support for GitLab and GitHub. Is Bitbucket on the roadmap? And if it is not, or if in the meantime, is there any kind of a workaround or manual steps you can use to make it work with the Rancher pipelines?
We would like to see Bitbucket. In general, it would be nice to just have generic Git polling. Would be something that I'd want to see sooner than later. That way nobody's left out in the cold. It wouldn't be ideal, but if it's polling every minute, it's certainly better than not working at all. Then adding additional private enterprise or other providers. There's certainly a handful that folks use. We're, from what we've seen, just talking to customers, GitHub and GitHub Enterprise and GitLab and are some of the more popular prevalent ones. So we just started with those. Yeah, so let me show you what the new version of pipelines is starting to look like. So this is my Rancher 2 UI. I've got a single cluster called pipelines. In there, I've got my sort of the QuickStart. So on workloads, pipelines is still here. When it's been enabled, we're deploying Jenkins. We've added Minio and Docker Registry, so you'll see those pop up. We're using Minio to store all the build logs. We had been originally, I think in the first pass, we were stuffing them in etcd and realized it's a bad idea. And then Docker Registry. So as we got into deployments, what we wanted is sort of an out-of-the-box experience where you can deploy immediately. But this registry, think of it more like a cache. It's not really a registry that we're going to give you access to or host or store or make persistent in any way, shape, or form at this time. So what we've got now is these, we have these new example repositories. And so, you'll come to pipelines and you'll be able to just configure. And if you want to just kind of see what it's all about, you'll be able to enable one of these examples, either PHP or we have a Maven example. And so when you do that, and you get kind of this neat little pipeline, and you can say, okay, what is that? How does this look? What does that look like? And sort of, you can edit the configuration and sort of just see, we've got the concept of stages, and these run linearly. And then within a stage, you can have multiple steps, and those would run in parallel, similar to the concepts that you were seeing kind of in the GitLab UI. So you can add multiple things. So here I can say I want to add an additional, shell script, and I'll run that in, just Alpine, and I'll just say, hello. So now these two would run in parallel. What's pretty neat now is this is this configuration now happens live, and so if we had GitHub OAuth turned on and I was able to push to this repository, I can just save it directly to a specific branch in the repository, and then that would update the CI for this, and it's all based on kind of OAuth and the person making the changes permissions on that repository. And if you don't, you can just download the configuration file, and so now I'll have I'll have a now I have the Rancher pipeline YAML, and I can create just copy this file into the repository, make a PR, and that would be that would be how I could get that change in. So now we're giving you a couple different ways to sort of kind of configure and enable that repository. But for anything real, you'll want to configure that, and again, it's configured per project. You can have GitLab or GitHub integration. You provide it, the client ID, client secret, tokens for OAuth, and you click authenticate, and then you will see all your repositories. So I've got another environment up. This one's configured, and so then I can configure how many pipeline executors for this project. If I come to workloads, I go to configure repositories. I can see all my repositories and search through them and add different and I can enable a new one, and then I'll configure a webhook, and so now I'll have multiple pipelines. If I go to edit this, this will go and it'll run this latest script, and then if I wanted to, I could then add another step, publish, and then each one of these has a set of advanced options. So I can say only run this when the branch is master, or I can say when the event is a pull request or a tag or push, or don't run this when I have inclusive and exclusive rules that I can add and publish these things out. If I wanted to, we have other types where we can build and publish, and so you give it the Docker file. If you just give it a name, hello, this will at the end will get published to the local caching one. Otherwise, I can say, publish it up to, hub, and I can come here and click add a registry, and this will allow me to add registry credentials for another project, and I can use that in the pipeline.
So Bill, as you're putting this all together, I mean, there was a question that came in. There is the API for Rancher built around all of this. So can I do that via the CLI or the API as well, or can I only do this stuff in the UI?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked under the hood, but yeah, everything we do is API driven. So if there's a UI for it, it is using an API, and anything that, so yeah, you can enable it via API and do anything that I'm doing in the UI with an API.
And the other question, there's a couple questions about different registries. So can we still use an external registry with Rancher pipelines for easy rollback to previous image versions? I think Donald said, is it possible to publish to Amazon ECR? Anything you can chat about there?
Yeah, again, we only have the local public caching one, so you don't have to do anything. You can just get it up and running. But I think for anything that you were going to do, at some point you would need to publish to an actual registry. So just sort of looking at that. Yeah, and you can just edit this YAML file. So you can enable it, and then in the next commit, add this YAML file and push it straight up to, your next commit will start building and it'll just start working. And then you never have to come to the UI to build it. So there's a whole YAML syntax that allows you to add build steps and stages. So you won't have to use the Rancher UI for this. And it's similar to the experience that you get with like a drone or Travis, right? You click enable, and then every commit after that, and it basically gets the job definition, from the repository, this Rancher pipelines YAML file. So that is a big change that we made, kind of from what we originally started with to where we're going, is that this file is now authoritative and it lives in the repository.
And there was another question. Somebody said maybe I missed it, but what are the main advantages of using this versus the GitLab pipelines that we looked at earlier? Do you want to just kind of talk about that briefly?
Yeah, I mean, if you've already gone all in on GitLab and you're using that to run on another Kubernetes cluster, yeah, keep doing that. Rancher 2 largely, I mean, we're aiming to deliver Kubernetes and not get in the way of, the ecosystem that's built around it. But if you're just getting started or just kind of coming into it, there's a lot of things like to get up and running. And so, we're also trying to help you get up and running quickly, right? So we've got, monitoring, logging, log aggregation, and pipelines. I think, if you look at what people are trying to do right away is, I need this cluster. Okay, now I got a cluster, and then, part of it is now I go find 50 tools and I go put them all together, and now I have, now I have an operational cluster. Rancher is trying to help, shorten that time before you can actually start achieving value from your investment in, in running Kubernetes clusters or, operating on Kubernetes. So, we're not, telling you, our CICD system is better than, Concourse or GitLab. It is, here is a tool that, it's built into the product. You get up and running quickly, and as you kind of, get into it, if you find that, there's another tool that better suits your needs, or we're not doing, you have options. And that's really what we're trying to do here. But
one of the other questions, Bill, David asked, how do you deal with runners on different OSs, like Mac OS for iOS and Mac OS projects? Could you create a runner externally?
No, at this point, we're really focused on running within the cluster that it's deployed in. And so right now, that would be, a Linux-based cluster. and that would be the runners running on that. So the images, yeah. So I mean, yeah, in order to do Mac or something else, this process wouldn't necessarily be it, unless you could use this to build images, push up to like Docker Hub, which then has some sort of webhook that then triggers build processes on other things. But no, this isn't, this won't help at this point with mobile app development and building iOS apps.
Right, and there was a couple questions just about, I think, some confusion about the version that you're using. This is not yet in the Rancher 2.0.8, the latest version. It's in a this will be coming out in a couple of in the next release, or the release after, over the next month or so. You should see this. So like right now, if you go to use this, you'll just see GitHub as a source code repository option. GitLab wouldn't be available. That will be coming as part of this rollout, correct?
Yeah, the GitHub, GitLab project level scope, that's all coming in the next iteration and in the next release. So we've got a release 2.07-ish, or 7 is the next scheduled release, and that's fairly imminent. It will not be in that one. It'll be most likely in the release right after that. Yeah, and so you'll be able to start getting access to some of these capabilities.
Okay. Yeah. Why don't you finish up the demo? Sorry, I'll slow down with the questions for a minute.
Yeah, no worries. So I have another one that I've worked out. It's pretty simple. It's doing a clone, a build, and a deploy. And so the deploy is basically right now it's a kube apply to a single YAML file. We're working to get that to a directory, and we've got some basic substitutions that you can do. So just quickly looking at that. So right now we have the CICD execution sequence. We have a few variables, and so we don't run a straight kube apply. We run it through basically a sed script that swaps out some of these variables that kind of get passed along in the pipeline. So you'll be able to, in this case, what I'm doing is each build basically gets its own deployment, its own ingress, and its own service. So every build would get deployed, and I could see it on its own unique URL. There's other strategy. I could do something on branches. I could constantly update the same the same deployment off the same branch, off of a different build tag or something. This is just one way that I thought was sort of interesting and straightforward. But it has drawbacks in that there's no cleanup or anything like that. So, but it's a strategy that works, and it demos pretty well. So, with this is just a basic Hugo site. So I'll just go and I'll just edit my first post, and I'll just say, hi from the live demo. Push to master because it's always good. And now, based on the PR, or not PR, sorry, based on the push, webhook was sent, and so now we're building it out. And what you'll see is we'll do the clone. And it'll do a build. So it's using a newer version of Docker, and for the build, while it's doing that, I'm doing a multi-stage build. So it's just basically copying all the content, running Hugo to render the static site, and then from that build, basically just putting it into an Nginx container that I'll run behind an as a Kubernetes deployment behind an ingress, and it'll update in live. So here it's building and publishing up to the local registry. So now I should have a copy of it up and running. So if I come back to workloads, and I can see that I now have my pipeline 7 workload. I guess I didn't deploy the service. But now I have a URL that says, hey, welcome to Rancher CA, and then hi, live from the demo. If I didn't like that change, I can say, last word. So we'll let that build. While that's going, just so I can show you how there's multiple versions.
Bill, while you're doing this, there was a question that said, how does demo work without a web server, either Apache or Nginx?
I'm sorry, one more time?
Can you hear? Yeah, I was just saying, there was a question from Chatula who said, how did that demo work without a web server like Apache or Nginx or something in the Kubernetes cluster?
Oh, so as part of the Kubernetes deployment, well, the app itself is Nginx, or getting deployed as a static site in Nginx. But as the deployment, I'm creating the deployment. That's my current Nginx, which is just a web service that's sitting behind an ingress. This is an RKE cluster, a custom one that by default installs the Nginx ingress controller. You can disable that and install other ingress controllers, but the ingress is basically how you route traffic into the cluster. And so basically what I've done is I've got a wildcard DNS pointing to the ingress controller hosts, and so all of them, they each get a unique name, pipelines-CICD execution, and then star.demo.cloudnautique.com is pointing at that ingress. So anything resolves there. And then this service is adding, basically setting up the endpoints so that the ingress gets populated. Okay, this is finished. So now if I come to workloads, I now have a version 8 and saying I get the last word. So, each one of them would get their own unique URL. And I think this is sort of where things kind of get interesting is sort of, now that I had 2 versions, if you could integrate this with like a service mesh and you could do canary deployments, I could say, okay, start sending 1% to this one and keep that or have some stable. But yeah, that's down the road. But anyway, the a standard, to answer that question, original question, yeah, just the ingress controller is managing and routing traffic to my backend services, which was deployed as part of the the cluster.
Got it. Is there? There's a question from Kayleen who asked, is there an easy way to update GitHub PR statuses with the results of the stage? Any thoughts on that? Right now, I'm having to set up stage, which runs a script and sends a request to GitHub to let know whether the stage passed or failed, etc.
Yeah, we should. I don't think it's in there yet, but yeah, we should probably look at just updating the statuses on the builds. That I think should be a pretty straightforward integration on our side. But that would be nice.
Cool. David said, how far away is this version of CI/CD from being deployed in Rancher 2? I think you already said you expected this month, correct?
Yeah, towards the end of the month. Like I said, 207 has to ship before we'll put any new major features into master. So these are kind of on hold at the moment. Yeah, there's the current, we have to figure out a little bit more work around some of the local registry and sort of locking that down a little bit more. But from a UX perspective, it's feeling a lot like the improvements are pretty dramatic. So we're pretty excited about it.
Awesome. Is there any, there was another couple questions about this earlier, but is there any doc for Helm chart deployment with Rancher and get CI/CD config for that on AWS? Anything you're seeing or approaches that are working for, when you're wanting to deploy using Helm?
Yeah, I mean, so the simplest and most straightforward way to do it would be to have a shell script that runs the Helm command line. In order to make that work in Rancher, you'd have to install Tiller. Just some history on that. I think folks have asked earlier in the conversation. We support the Helm chart, but what we've done initially was we did Helm template and rendered the YAML files and then did kubectl apply. And the reason we did that is just in order to ensure the project isolation. Tiller wants to deploy, but default Tiller wanted to deploy into kube system, and it can create namespace, and it just sort of blew apart the the multi-tenant model that we were going for. So we're bringing that back. It won't be in this next release, but it'll also be in this the release the next after 207. Provided there's no, I'm not sure what number that'll be, but after 207, it'll make its way back in. A lot of folks wanted the pre and post hooks, and so yeah. But basically, run Helm directly from your CI/CD process against that, and you can have a values YAML file or set all the args that you want on the command line and execute it that way.
Awesome. And then there was a question from he said, how does the automatic FQDN and ingress happen when you push?
So for this, I have an ingress. This is a simple model, but I created a wildcard DNS entry that pointed to the ingress. So anything, and then on the ingress definition, I create an ingress that's pipelines dash, CI/CD execution sequence, something unique. So basically, anything with the preceding this will get routed. All DNS entry query or all traffic will basically go to this endpoint, and so whether the ingress will respond to it or not is based on whether it's got an ingress rule behind it. But yeah, it's just wildcard DNS and then host header routing to the services. So it's just layer 7 HTTP stuff.
Got it. And then David asked if there was access to the artifacts of the CI build somewhere.
So the logs are stored on that Minio installation inside the pipeline, and then currently the only artifact that's sort of long-lived is the Docker image. This is so if you built binaries or something like that, you would have to publish those as like a shell script or something in a stage on your own to something outside of that. It's not preserving the workspace or anything like that. In fact, we're pretty adamant about being, it being an ephemeral workspace.
Awesome. Anything else you wanted to show in the demo, Bill?
No, not right now. That's currently what we got.
Awesome. thank you for going through it in so much depth. There's a whole bunch of questions that are a little bit off topic, not as much about CI/CD, that we can dive into now with some remaining time. But I wanted to just take a minute to thank you and Chris for spending so much time to to go through all this and go through it in so much depth. I know it's it takes a lot of time to set up these demos and to put it all together. So I really appreciate that. Why don't we, just really quickly kind of wrap up with a couple of wrap-up things, and then we'll dive into the remaining questions that are out there. Give me just 1 second to make myself the presenter again. Okay, so just a couple things. If you haven't ever set up Rancher before and you just want to get started, it's really very easy. You just need a Linux host somewhere, using either Ubuntu or RHEL or CentOS or Rancher OS or something with a reasonable amount of RAM and disk, and then you can just deploy, the Rancher server, just Docker run Rancher/Rancher:\latest, and you'll be able to set up a Rancher environment. There are very detailed QuickStart guides if you're trying to just get up to speed. You can find them on our website. There's also an awesome Slack channel. There's tons of people that are engaged on the forums. You can go to our Rancher/Rancher page on GitHub if you have questions, if anything isn't clear. So please don't hesitate to dive in there. Rancher OS, Archie, all of our projects are up there as well. So with that, and yeah, I think someone asked if Rancher's free. Yeah, Rancher's open source, so it's free. You can use it as much as you'd like to your heart's content. So hopefully this was really helpful, and this got into a lot of the information. I'm just going to go through and we'll dive into the remaining questions that you guys asked. Some of them were asked almost an hour and a half ago. So if you have more that weren't discussed, feel free to fire them away now. Or if you want to talk about other things that aren't really CI/CD related, we can dive into those now as well. But thank you everyone for attending. Okay, so this first question I think is a good question for you, Bill, and Tyler asked it. He said, has anyone automated etcd snapshot validation testing using CI/CD? Have you had any experience with this? I'm playing around with keeping my etcd snapshots in Git. It'd be pretty cool to get some CI/CD action on along with it. Any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I guess it's sort of what do you want to validate with that, and what does that need to look like? I mean, if you have your snapshot get pushed on a git commit, there's like to GitHub or something, then you would get a webhook that you could then do something with. And so depending on what that validation, if you're going to spin up another etcd cluster with it and validate keys exist or something, then you could. Nope, I haven't run into anyone that's doing that. Typically, most folks do. What we've seen is like S3 storage, and then they periodically will restore one and test it. But it'd be good to kind of do it, and if you do get a process, we'd love to see the blog, for sure. Like that'd be pretty cool.
Cool. There's a question that Raffle asked, and he's saying, I was trying to manage run C containers using Kubernetes and couldn't find a way to do it. Do you have any insights on that, Bill, about whether that's possible or approaches you might use that with Rancher?
I think that would be part of the container runtime interface project. I haven't personally dove into that side of things, but that's sort of the interface for abstracting out the container runtimes. And so that would be where I would start diving into that. But I haven't done that personally.
Okay, great. And then another question that Raffle asked is, do you have any experience running Rancher in Rancher? I don't think it's supported, but it'd be a really nice solution for Master Factory deploying Rancher to other clusters and somehow manage it. So if you wanted to kind of set up a Rancher environment and then use it to host multiple Ranchers, have you seen anyone doing this? Do anything about it? Have you know of any issues or gotchas that might prevent it from working well?
Would we support that, Bill? Because the CRDs that we put into etcd, would they not get overwritten?
Yeah, I think you'll run into some issues, but yeah, especially kind of going forward with what we're sort of thinking about. So currently, when you run Rancher, we use Kubernetes like an app server. So it's, we use CRD, we use that, we take it over and basically are running that. It's our database. It's, we're creating, Kubernetes resources to store data and controllers to watch that data and respond to events. So if you were to deploy Rancher into another cluster, that basically once Rancher realizes it's running in Kubernetes, it starts taking that one over. And so I think from an annotation, and in particular, it imports itself, the cluster it's running into itself. So I think because we do that, we probably would stomp on ourselves. And I know kind of moving one direction we're exploring with some of the HA stuff is moving some of the controllers out of the management plane back down to the user cluster. We've sort of changed our models a bit, and I think we can do that securely now. So that's something we're looking at, and I think that would sort of also maybe get in the way of sort of supporting that model at the moment. But there might be a way to a flag or something that would make it more standalone, but then you would probably lose the HA nature of it.
Yeah.
Seems like it might be worth a longer discussion. If you want to shoot an email over to Bill or Chris, they're just bill@rancher.com, chris@rancher.com, or shannon@rancher.com, and we're happy to discuss it in more depth. Alexander asked a question. Could you provide any information or provide a link or explain how to configure Azure disk and storage account, whatever, as a persistent volume? We've tried a number of ways to connect it, but been having a lot of problems. Do you have any experience with sort of working on Azure disk and storage? Just as an FYI too, our next meetup next month is going to be all about storage. So we're going to be talking about this in a lot of depth, both cloud hosted storage like EBS and Azure Disk and Google Disk, and as well as sort of on-prem stuff like iSCSI and NFS, and even some sort of cloud native storage things like Portworx or Storage OS. We'll give an update on Longhorn and demo some stuff there. So next month is going to be all about a storage masterclass. But can either of you guys talk a little bit about the Azure disk issue?
So I've not tried it, but I believe that once you've set the cloud config, the cloud provider to Azure, and then add in the storage, and you have to provide some like account keys and things, then when you actually have a pod that requires some storage to be spun up for it, basically it will it can handle it natively because Kubernetes will talk natively to it. But unless you've got the cloud provider set correctly to Azure, you can't use Azure disks.
So it's all about setting it up using the cloud provider.
Yeah. Same with EBS volumes.
If you're creating a cluster, can you do that if you've already created the cluster? Can you go in and retroactively add the cloud provider?
I don't know if we support changing. I think we probably do. I've not tried it. I don't know.
Okay, great. All right. Ciro asked a question. He said, if I install Rancher inside a VM on Proxmox, is there some method to have the same feature when I expand the cluster on new nodes, like in VMware or in a cloud provider or something? Does that make sense to you guys? Sorry, I'm not quite sure about the question.
Yeah, I've not got any experience of Proxmox, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I mean, Proxmox is just like a vSphere type of thing, but it doesn't cost as much.
Once you set it up you created a cluster, you can add, as long as the hosts are reasonably, well connected on network, you could add hosts from different types into the same Kubernetes cluster, right, Bill?
Yeah, so you could expand with other hosts on different platforms for sure. Where it gets tricky with doing the cloud is, as you were saying, if network latency is high, that we don't recommend that. So we typically, unless you have within tens of milliseconds of latency between you and your cloud provider, we probably wouldn't recommend spanning that. And then typically there's also some challenges in the neighborhood, in the areas of like storage, like you couldn't use the cloud provider is sort of set per cluster, and so you couldn't use, like the cloud provider's thing and then expect something to run. You have like an affinity problem if you were to try and leverage like cloud features, but if you're running a fairly generic cluster with low latency between you and the cloud provider, it ought to work. We've got some customers that have, they're looking at running their own storage and sort of getting access to that across a couple different and then getting compute from a couple different sources, but they have really fast interconnects between all of them. So it requires some engineering to sort of figure out what that needs to look like.
Right. Alvin asked a question: is there any plans or timeline for Terraform scripts to deploy Rancher in HA mode on AWS for Rancher 2.0?
Yeah, we're working on Terraform modules for 2.0 on the different cloud providers, similar to what we had for 1.6. I think it's a work in progress. I'm not sure on the exact delivery timelines.
Great. And then another question was from, I'm sorry, I can't even pronounce his name. It's in Russian characters, but he asked, how do I remove a stack from a workload? Did they remove from close, or do they infinitely stay like pipeline 400, pipeline -XXX? Sorry, I'm not 100% clear on the question. Maybe you guys can kind of read it and see if it makes any more sense to you.
Yeah, I think if it's sort of based on what the demo is doing, like it's going to incrementally deploy a new version forever. I think this was a simple example, just sort of showcasing the capability. I think there's some practical limitations, but to aid that, I think it would be nice, like if I was to round out that particular one, I would want a step where there was either some sort of validation or manual confirmation that that's what I wanted, and then have it automatically removed for me, or possibly promote something. But basically, if I was to do like a branching strategy, if the branch was deleted, then remove that environment. So there's a couple different things that we sort of need to add into as base functionality to the platform to help clean up under certain circumstances.
And then kind of following up on the earlier question about Terraform, Kaushik asked, are there any Terraform scripts for Rancher 2.0? It doesn't need to really be Terraform modules, but any progress just on Terraform scripts to configure and deploy Rancher?
I've seen that we've got a QuickStart guide with AWS Terraform and sort of kind of a single shot.
Yeah, that was published this morning.
Yeah. So
but it doesn't set you up HA. It just basically it provisions you some EC2 instances, runs Rancher upon it, and then basically creates a child cluster and registers it into the Rancher control. But yeah, it's a good starting point to give you all of the automation.
Where would you find that?
So if you go to github.com/rancher/quickstart, there's DigitalOcean, Terraform, there's AWS Terraform, and there is Vagrant.
We have the links on our docs page?
Is it QuickStart one word or quick-start?
No, just QuickStart, all one word.
Okay.
You can get to it from the docs page too?
Yep.
Great.
Yep.
I just published the link out in the question session, so if anyone wanted to see that, please take a look. Okay, so there's another question that maybe this is a good question for you, Bill, and it's a question David asked. It's kind of a big question. He said, are you guys working on any kind of docs that explain to developers how to participate in Rancher development? So tools that are required, what's used for rendering, running local builds, etc. There's a lot of people who are wanting to participate in contributing to Rancher, submitting fixes, etc. But it's kind of hard to find good docs on how to participate. There are people doing stuff outside of it, but anything you can share about what's going on the participation and community support side?
Well, I know recently we've added the code of conduct, just sort of, mostly interacting around issues and just kind of the general behavior. As far as contributors guide, we don't have that yet, and we should. Is really, I mean, I can say that the tooling it's actually pretty nice, but it just needs to be explained in a doc. Most of the requirements for any Rancher project are make and Docker available on the hosts, and so if you make build, it will build it. If you make release, it will release it. Well, as far as you can take it, but it'll build all the images and all the binaries.
Sounds like it's not well documented though.
It isn't. I mean, even just as a basic onboarding guide for our own employees, it would probably be a good idea to have something. It's mostly
all right, cool. So it looks like something that there's at least been some issue, some attention to, but more work needed. One of the questions that Niranjan asked was, is there any plan to allow DigitalOcean block storage within Kubernetes clusters? I didn't know that you couldn't use DigitalOcean block storage. Is there? I think there's a DigitalOcean cloud provider, so but I don't know if maybe it doesn't support block storage.
Yeah, I haven't used the DO cloud provider, but typically, the storage is wired up through the cloud provider. If that's not there, there's Flex Volume plugins, or there's the new cloud storage interface that's coming out. So if there was a plugin, if they have a plugin that's available that way, depending on what the Kubernetes way of interacting with that storage is, Rancher, I think, can support almost all of those at this point. I just don't know that we've taken the time to kind of dig into that piece yet. I know we're looking at integrating with their Kubernetes solution as an integration, just being able to get a cluster like you can get EKS or AKS. But hopefully that, I think with their Kubernetes integration, I think they've done the bits so that it's all integrated to their cloud stack or cloud provider. So
awesome.
I guess we just have to kind of dive into it.
All right, well, that was the last of the questions. So Bill and Chris, thank you so much for all this. Everyone who attended, and we still have hundreds of people here even 2 hours later. So thank you to everyone for attending, for your questions, for for participating in the community. We really appreciate it. Have a wonderful afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are, and we'll next month's meetup is going to be about storage. We're going to be diving into a masterclass on storage. So similar to last month's networking masterclass, we'll really get into the weeds on different approaches to storage next month. So hopefully that will be useful for a lot of you. I know it's an area we get tons of questions about. So have a great week. Thanks again, Bill and Chris, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Take care.
Bye.